make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
So, through a series of really unlikely things, after Britain managed to take control of this territory, what's called Palestine, from the Ottomans in World War I, the British say, we actually support this idea of the creation of a Jewish state. And in 1948, Israel actually does become a Jewish state, and Zionism is the ideology of this state. There are lots of different kinds of Zionists, but to be a Zionist is basically to support this enterprise as a state.
Well, hey there, faithful politics viewers and listeners. If you're joining us on our podcast stream, welcome to another episode of Faithful Politics Podcast. I am your host or your co-host, Josh Bertram, faithful host, of course. And we have our political host with us, Will Wright. It's good to see you, Will.
Good to be seen. Thanks, Josh.
Absolutely. And here on Faithful Politics, of course, we love talking about all things controversial and hitting at the center of what's happening in America today in the news and in around religion and politics. And today we're super excited to be able to have Peter Beinart, who is a professor of journalism and political science at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at City University of New York. He is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and editor-at-large of Jewish Currents. He previously served as the editor of The New Republic from 1999 to 2006 and has written extensively on American foreign policy, liberalism, Zionism, and Jewish identity. And we are super excited to have him on to talk with us about all things going on in Gaza and particularly his newest book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Peter, thanks so much for coming on the program.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. So I got to ask, why did you feel like you had to write a book about being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza? Please help us hear the origin story of the book and its basic thesis for our audience.
Well, I live my life in a pretty traditional set of Jewish communities. These are the communities that really sustain me and my family. And I've for a long time been very troubled by how Israel treats Palestinians. For me, Judaism is like Christianity, Islam, ancient religion with many, many, many voices, and can be understood in many different ways. But for me, at the base of it is the idea that Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, don't start with a Jewish story. They start with universal human beings. That the first human beings we encounter in Torah, Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, the generation of Noah. These are universal human beings. They're not Jews or Israelites or proto-Jews or Israelites. They're universal human beings. And the rabbis interpret that, the message is as saying something about the inherent dignity and worth of all human beings. And so when I saw particularly what Israel was doing in Gaza in response to the terrible attacks of October 7th, broadcast daily, on these screens, I was very, very deeply upset by what I was seeing. I mean, we now see that Gaza has more child amputees than any other place, per capita than any other place on earth. 80% of the homes destroyed, 70% of the farmland. The estimates by the best international scholars who study death in war suggest that perhaps 100,000 people have been killed. And this is in a population of only 2.2 million people. It's an astonishingly high percentage of people who've killed or injured. And I was looking in these communities that are part of my life, and what I saw was an intense mourning of the death of Israelis who had been killed on October 7th and had been kidnapped, as of course there should have been, and an intense desire to humanize the people who had been killed. But almost no corresponding effort to really grapple with the weight of the far larger number of Palestinians who have been killed, and to remember that they are also just not numbers, that they are human beings with their own stories, with their own families, with their inherent God-given dignity. And I was deeply troubled by this, and I wanted to try to understand the stories that are told in Jewish communities that I think in a way separate people from their best selves, make people who in many other parts of their lives, I know from firsthand experience, are very, very empathetic, very sensitive, generous, intellectually curious. But I feel like often on this subject in our community, in the American Jewish, in the Jewish community, a wall goes up and it divides people from their best selves. And it's because of a series of narratives that I think are doing tremendous damage, not just to Palestinians, but I think also to Israeli Jews. And I actually think to Judaism itself. And so it was about those stories that I wanted to write, and I wanted to try to question them and suggest that we might think about different stories about what it means to be Jewish.
You know, there are like a couple different worlds that I have found myself in since starting this podcast. And mind you, like, I know you have probably done a lot more, interviews with people with much higher profiles, right, than Josh or I, and that's fine. But what I'm curious about is like the term like Zionism or anti-Zionism is a term that I have heard a lot in the past couple of years that I've never really heard. I never really had a firm understanding of what it was. The picture is becoming a little bit more clearer. My sort of layman understanding is if you say something against Israel, it could be perceived as anti-Zion. That's probably a very poor definition, but I'd love for you to maybe just help a person that's not necessarily immersed in some of the pop talk of the day. Like, what is anti-Zionism, and how does your book either address that or tries not to fit in that mold?
Sure. So the term Zion is really, in the Bible, in a Jewish tradition, a kind of synonym for Jerusalem or the land of Israel, right? And so in Jewish tradition, Jews have, since the destruction of the Second Temple, in 70 CE, Jews have created a religion in which is centered on that land. So when Jews pray, they pray facing Jerusalem. In Jewish religious texts, there are innumerable references to the wish for the rebuilding of the temple, for Jews to return to this land. But in Jewish religious tradition, this is always associated with the coming of messianic time. So Jewish religious law, we're talking about for literally millennia, basically said the responsibility of Jews is to pray for a return to this land, but it will be done in God's time, and God will decide how it happens. But in the late 19th century in Europe, a series of things happen that lead a group of people who start calling themselves Zionists to say, essentially, we can't wait for God to do this anymore. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, Jewish hatred of Jews is resurgent. There are nationalist movements all over Europe as these European empires are crumbling. But the Jews are feeling, some of them, that they can't really be included in these nationalist movements, that as people try to construct a Ukrainian or Polish or Hungarian or German or French nation, that they're not really including Jews, even though Jews have lived in these places for a long time. And so it's also, and this is the controversial part this is the point that anti-Zionists tend to emphasize much more Zionists, but I think it is worth referencing. It's also a high point of European colonialism, right? That Europeans are looking outside of Europe for parts of the world that they can kind of settle and maybe bring civilization and modernity to. And so in this cauldron of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and imperialism, you see Jews who say, you know what, we need our own nationalist movement, but it's got to be in the historic land of Israel, in what's then the Ottoman Empire, because that's our historic land, and that's where we were meant to go, and we can't wait for the Messiah. And many of these people were actually not religious; they were secular, so they were saying we're not going to wait for God to act; we're going to act. And so, through a series of really unlikely things, after Britain managed to take control of this territory, what's called Palestine, from the Ottomans in World War I, the British say, we actually support this idea of the creation of a Jewish state. And in 1948, Israel actually does become a Jewish state. And Zionism is the ideology of this state. There are lots of different kinds of Zionists, but to be a Zionist is basically to support this enterprise as a state. And to be an anti-Zionist is to say the enterprise was wrong. The enterprise was unjust because most of the people who were living in this area were not Jews. They were not people who wanted to create a Jewish state. They were Arabic-speaking people who developed a Palestinian national identity. And it wasn't fair for Britain and Jews coming out of Europe to come and say, it should be ours because the Bible gave it to us or because we need it because we're not safe in Europe. And I would say that's the core of Zionism and anti-Zionism.
So what's interesting to me, right, in your story, you once identified as a liberal Zionist.
Yeah.
And so maybe you can help us understand what that is and then what shifted. something shifted, and I know that you've been alluding to that, but help us understand what shifted and what experiences, relationships, texts, what catalyzed that shift for you?
So, I grew up in a way that I think is pretty typical among many Jews, most Jews, certainly in my generation, in the United States and around the world, in which the way we saw Israel was that Jews had not had a country of our own, and Jews had been unsafe. Jews had been persecuted for long periods of time. And then there was this kind of culmination in the Nazi Holocaust, right, in which 2/3 of the Jews of Europe were killed. So the Zionist answer was Jews will be safe when Jews have our own country with our own army, we protect ourselves. That was just kind of intuitive in the world in which the communities in which I grew up. It wasn't really questioned, Now, I did, as I got older, come to see that I thought Israel was doing some things that didn't seem to me quite right. That Israel isn't, in 1967, Israel conquered these territories, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and it took control of all these Palestinians who didn't give citizenship to. It really couldn't give them citizenship because then that would change the demography of Israel, and Israel would no longer have a Jewish majority. So Israel took the land, began settling the land with, particularly the West Bank, with its own Jewish settlers, but the Palestinians there were held without citizenship under military law. And I did start to get the sense that this was a problem with this, and that so I was convinced that there should be a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Right? Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. This is sometimes called like the two-state solution, right? But it seemed to me, okay, so Israel would be smaller and it wouldn't have this terrible violation of democracy by holding these people without rights. But surely we would still need a Jewish state to be safe. And that was the view that I held literally probably from the age of, my teenager years when I started thinking about it up until a few years ago. But over time, I started spending more time with Palestinians. And I spent more time in the West Bank, seeing what Israel's control was like for Palestinians. And I began to have to wrestle with some more uncomfortable questions. And part of the discomfort was that the idea of partition, that Israel would live alongside a Palestinian state, seemed to be becoming harder and harder and harder because Israel was basically subsidizing more and more Israeli Jews to move into the West Bank and take more land in the place that Palestinians would have their own state, right? And so people started to say to me, well, is this really possible anymore? That was one challenging thing that I began to grapple with. The second and more difficult thing was the very notion of a Jewish state, right? At its core, what a Jewish state means is that Jews rule, right? And to rule, among other things, Jews have to have a very large majority of the voters have to be Jewish, right? Because if they're not, then you can't be sure that the Jews will rule, right? The problem with this is, from a moral perspective, is when Israel was created, well, there are two problems. First of all, 20% of Israel's own citizens are Palestinian citizens, right? They are called Arab Israelis. They live inside Israel. They have citizenship, but they're not equal citizens, right? You can't really be an equal citizen if you're in a Jewish state. If the state says our fundamental priority is to Jews rule, if you're in that state, you're not equal, right? And this is something actually as an American Jew, I'm pretty sensitive to, right? Because in my community, American Jews would really not be very excited about the idea of making America explicitly a Christian nation because we know that then we're not really equal. So how can I say that that's wrong here, but it's right there? Secondly, when Israel was created, in fact, the only way that Israel was able to create this very large Jewish majority in its creation in 1948 was through a mass expulsion of Palestinians. Now, there's some debate about this. Some Palestinians fled out of fear. Some were actually expelled at gunpoint. But more than half of the Palestinian population was driven out and never allowed back in. So, and the Zionist argument, the pro-Israel argument is you can't allow them back in because then the Jewish majority would become too low and Jews wouldn't rule anymore. But when I met more and more Palestinians some who had literally been forced out when they were children and they wanted to be able to have the right to return to this place, I began thinking, what's the moral logic that allows a Jew like me, whose family hasn't lived there perhaps for 2,000 years, to go there and live and be a citizen? But someone who was literally born there and 75 years ago was expelled, or their children, they can't return. Like, that just doesn't comport with my basic notions of fairness. And it also doesn't comport with my ideas about the United States, that if I believe that countries should treat everybody equally under the law, that countries shouldn't be the property of one religious or racial or group. And we're fighting about that in America. And how can I take that position coherently in America, a country that provides everyone equality under the law, irrespective of race, religion, ethnicity, and oppose that principle in Israel-Palestine. And that's what moved me towards the position of believing that that everyone in this territory should be equal under the law in a state or states, if there were partition, in which there's no favoritism for people of one religious or ethnic or racial group.
I mean, in theory, it sounds like it would be better than whatever it is now, right? Because, I mean, right now there's people dying every single day and it seems very chaotic and whatnot. But it's like, is that even possible? I mean, with just the intermingling of, I don't know, the two religions, make a case for why it could work.
Well, it seems to me if Jews and Palestinians are going to live alongside each other, and I think they are going to be living alongside each other no matter what, even if there were a Palestinian state, even if there were partition, again, because 20% of Israel's own citizens are Palestinian. I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza now. And probably because there'd be Jews in a Palestinian state too, given how many Jews have moved to the West Bank. I actually think if you got people of different religions or ethnicities living alongside, races living alongside each other, things are more likely to be peaceful if everyone has a voice in government. I think violence is most likely to break out when one group is excluded from government. Because when one group is excluded, you don't have the right to vote, the government doesn't listen to you. That's when it's most likely that people take up arms. Most people don't take up arms as a first resort. They take up arms if they feel like that's the only way of basically trying to bring change, of trying to get the attention of a government that won't listen to them. And one of the things that influenced me in this thinking is my family is South African. So I know how afraid most white South Africans were of the idea of black people getting the vote, right? They saw that the Nelson Mandela's African National Congress was using violence to try to overthrow the apartheid system. And they were like, wait a second, these guys are using violence against us. If we don't have this supremacist political system, our lives are going to be at risk. But actually, white South Africans were much safer because black South Africans got the right to vote. Because when black South Africans had the right to vote, they had a nonviolent mechanism of having the government listen to them. They didn't need to have a military organization. It's the same reason why in Northern Ireland, the Irish Republican Army stopped blowing up buildings in London and put away their arms because Catholics got political equality. So these things can be really messy. I totally see where they're messy in our own country. But I think that actually systems that try to give everyone political representation are safer for everybody.
So I just want to make sure that I love this, and I want to make sure I'm understanding the story correctly, the narrative correctly. So basically, growing up, you were essentially told the safest place that you could be for the Jewish people to be able to be preserved, right? Because there were clear attempts to exterminate them.
Yeah.
In history, horrifying, right? And so it's like, this is all very historically real. That's very real concern. So the issue is we're going to create our own space. But do you still feel like, I guess, of course, you would feel like that's not needed. That's what you're saying for that an anti-Zionism would mean that you didn't have a explicitly Jewish state, correct?
Yeah, it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be Jews who were living there.
Sure,
right,
sure.
Speaking Hebrew. I think the irony in a way, of the story that I grew up being told, which is that Jews needed our own state where we ruled, which is based on Jewish supremacy, Jewish legal supremacy, that we needed that to be safe, is that actually Israel is probably the least safe place to be Jewish of any large-scale Jewish community around the world, right? I mean,
interesting.
In the United States or Canada, Australia, Britain, whatever, France, Jews are small populations of the small percentages. We don't rule things, right? But we do have there is some system of liberal democracy so far. And actually Jews are safer in those countries than they are in Israel. And to me, the reason is because a system of political supremacy imposes a lot of violence on people who are legal inferiors. Now, that violence is is sometimes hidden from people who have supremacy, but it's only a system of violence that can deny people their basic rights. And when that system of violence produces counter-violence, and I think makes people less safe. I mean, I think we can see that lesson in our own country, which is to say, I think about the American South, for instance, right? And I wonder sometimes, what would the American South been like if the civil rights movement had failed? If Black Americans had not gotten the right to vote in 1965 in the South? My guess would be, I don't want to romanticize the South or America at all. My guess would be that the South would be a much more dangerous place for everybody today if Black Americans had not gotten the right to vote, because you would have this very large population of people who would not have any nonviolent mechanism of getting their needs met by the state. And that's why I think that the idea of Jewish supremacy as leading to Jewish safety, even though it's intuitive to a lot of people, and even though it's the view that most Jews around the world, and even in the United States, still hold, to me, I actually don't think it makes sense.
I'd love to get your thoughts about, like, what are American, like, Jews saying, about the war over there and the conflict, and is it different than Jews that are actually living in Israel? Is there a disconnect in kind of like how they view what's happening?
Yeah, there is some. I mean, in Israel, Jewish Israelis, some of them wanted to end the war because they wanted to get hostages back, and many of them don't like Benjamin Netanyahu. But there's a very, very broad consensus about the basic idea that Israel should control Palestinians who don't have basic rights. How exactly Israel should manage it, people debate about. But again, to go back to an American analogy, I would compare politics in Israel to politics in the Jim Crow South among white politicians. The people differed about strategies, but there was a very broad consensus that this system of supremacy should be maintained. What's interesting in the United States is that consensus is beginning to break down a little bit. You see a very large generational divide. So among older American Jews, there is a very, very strong belief. Again, not that people necessarily love Netanyahu or everything Israel does, but a very strong belief in the idea of a state that gives Jews legal privilege over Palestinians. But you're seeing among younger American Jews a pretty large group who are actually questioning that, right? And so it's creating a very, very difficult and strange, often very, very deep and painful divisions within a lot of families. So let's take Zohran Mamdani, for instance, the new mayor of New York, where I live, right? A lot of prominent American Jewish leaders said that he was anti-Semitic, right? He was an anti-Jewish bigot because he basically holds the same view I do, that Israel should not be a state of legal hierarchy, should be treated equally. So they were saying he was anti-Semitic, but the polls suggested that he won perhaps a third of the Jewish vote in New York, right? So it just shows that there's this growing divide among American Jews over some of these basic questions. There's much less of that divide in Israel itself among Jews.
Would you say that divide is broken up generationally? Because I'd imagine, like, either a person that has a view on this issue was probably born like, sometime circa 1940 or something like that. So just the conflict is very fresh, and it has been fresh for them for a very long time versus, some like millennial or something like that. So I'd love to just kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yes, there is a very striking generational divide. And interestingly, the generational divide isn't only among Jews, it's among Americans in general. We see actually in both parties, among Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, and progressives, there's this pretty stark generational divide. I think it's partly because social media, where younger people get their news, that's been a place that Palestinians have been able to speak and be represented more. Palestinians are not very well represented in kind of like mainstream American media. Edward Said, the Palestinian intellectual, famously said that Palestinians lack permission to narrate their own experience. But I think younger people, Jews and non-Jews, who are getting their media in other places, are actually seeing Palestinians, filming videos from Gaza or the West Bank or other places, and they're seeing this and they're saying, wait a second, something seems really wrong here. The story we've been told about Israel is this kind of like bastion of democracy, doesn't seem to fit. And so I think that's a big part of the reason for the shift.
How concerned are the powers that be? And I say that with such ignorance because I know right? Some of the names like Netanyahu, I'm certainly aware of who that is. But I don't know much about, right, the political governance of Israel, right? I don't know much about its laws. I don't know much about its political leaders. I've heard people come on the program talk about different programs, like, for instance, part of the government of Israel sending money to try to educate churches on, or try to help churches become maybe more pro-Israel, things like that. So you have these, and we've had guests on the show that have talked about that kind of stuff. And so you have these kinds of efforts, right? I guess maybe you call it propaganda. I don't know what you would call it. Everyone does propaganda in their own way, I think. So it's like, how concerned are the powers in Israel that there's a shift in American Jewish sentiment? Is that like, yeah, I'll just stop there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I think there's a lot of concern. There may in some ways even be greater concern about the shift in Christian sentiment. I think, in a way, I think
Interesting.
Netanyahu has, my sense of him actually is that he has always seen the fundamental guarantor of America's support from Israel as coming from conservative Christians. And and this goes back decades. I mean, going back even before him, you have people like the Israeli leaders have very strong relations with people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson. The largest pro-Israel organization in the United States is not a Jewish organization. It's Christians United from Israel, John Hagee's organization. And so I think that while the Israeli government is concerned about the fact that there's some American Jews who are becoming more critical, I think that, given that American Jews, there are many, many, many more Christians than there are Jews. I think that my sense is the thing that worries them more is what we're starting to see in among certain kind of Christian and even kind of like MAGA kind of figures, like Tucker Carlson, for instance, or, and a more and more extreme version like, Nick Fuentes. And that's worrying to me too, because while I think that I would like to see America end its unconditional military support for Israel, because I think Israel is committing terrible, terrible human rights violations. What seems to be happening, you all may know more about this than me, it seems to me in certain parts of the American right, you're moving from a kind of Christian Zionism, to a Christian anti-Zionism, which doesn't necessarily distinguish between Israel and Jews. So when I hear some of the things that certainly Nick Fuentes and even Tucker Carlson says about Israel, the way they talk about Israel sometimes suggests that they think the problem with Israel is that there's something about Jews or about Judaism that leads Jews to kind of not respect human life in the way that Christians do or something like that. And that to me is very, very disturbing. And so I think the Israeli leaders are very concerned about what's happening, because the whole America First ethos, in a way, which is somewhat isolationist, somewhat conspiratorial, is, questions why America would be supporting Israel in attacking Iran, questions why a group like AIPAC, which is very connected to the Israeli government, would have so much influence in Washington. And I think this is a big problem for them.
Yeah. So real quick, well, the only thing I would say is I understand not only the concern, there's all sorts of concerns. I know it gets really complicated, but with the Christian shift, there is no guarantee that Christian sentiment towards Jewish people in Israel will stay positive, given the historical nature of that question. Maybe probably even more towards Jerusalem and Israel, because that's our holy land. We want that's where Jesus was. That's where the apostles were, all that stuff. Right. But the shift towards Jewish people, you've seen obviously in history, Christianity taking very violent and horrifying stances towards Jewish people at several different times, obviously. And so I can understand the deep concern there.
Yeah. And to me, again, I go back, to me, the fundamental principle is people in America, regardless of their religion, their ethnicity, race, should not be held responsible for what a foreign government does because they share a religion or an ethnicity race. There was remember, during the COVID, right, there were these terrible attacks on Chinese Americans. They were not responsible for what the Chinese government was doing, good or bad. And so American Jews should not be held responsible for what Israel is doing.
No
Muslims
way.
should be held responsible for what ISIS is doing, right? But unfortunately, part of the problem is that actually some of the American Jewish organizations themselves tend to conflate these things and basically to say, essentially, that to be Jewish is to be a supporter of the state of Israel. And I actually think that makes it harder for us to fight against this kind of anti-Semitism in which people say, oh, I don't like what Israel's doing. Well, there must be a problem with Jews.
That sounds so much kind of like what Josh and I often do, especially when we try to talk to people about Christian nationalism. Like we speak a lot about Christian nationalism, talk to a lot of experts. Josh and I are both Christians, but we're not Christian nationalists. And it's like, you know, as a Christian, like I want to speak about this because I just think it's terrible for my faith, you know, and from what I'm hearing, it sounds like you really, you know, want to speak out because you're like, hey, not all Jewish people are like that. So I love to hear maybe like what's the biggest obstacle like you have to get over when people, you know, hear that you're Jewish? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think I really appreciate you bringing up Christian nationalism because I think there are a lot of similarities, I think, between the dangers of Christian nationalism and the dangers of the way Israel is understood in a lot of Jewish spaces. And I think there's also other examples. I think of like Narendra Modi and what they call Hindutva, which is a kind of Hindu nationalism, which, you know, to me, you know, one of the figures that I quoted in my book, one of my heroes, was an Orthodox Israeli social critic named Yeshayahu Leibovich. And Leibovich was asked the question, does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state? And his answer was no. No state has a right to exist. Human beings have a right to exist because they're created in the image of God. States are just instruments for the protection of human life. If they do a good job of protecting human life and allowing human beings to flourish, they can be really valuable. But they have only conditional, not unconditional value. And if they are destroying human life, then we have an obligation to reimagine them so they will better respect the dignity and the worth of human beings, right? But what happens, I think, what I see and you would know more than me, it seems to me among some people in a kind of Christian nationalist world, it's like there's a vision of America which is deified and considered to be more important than the humanity of all the people who live in this country, right? And I see that vis-a-vis Israel as well, in which the question is not, do Palestinians have a right to exist, to live with dignity, but does this state have a right to exist within this particular political formulation? And you find in Jewish communities, and again, I don't know how this is similar or not similar, this is in some Christian communities, but like the test of whether you are a good Jew, right, is not whether you abide by Jewish law, right? Whether you keep Shabbat, whether you keep kosher, whether you visit the sick, whether you wash the bodies of the dead, whether you give charity, or you know, none of these things. These are actually foundational things in Jewish religious texts. But the test of whether you are a good Jew is whether you unconditionally support the state of Israel, right? And to me, to make a state an object of worship, to say it has unconditional value is idolatry, because a state is something created by human beings, and it is idolatrous to worship something created by human beings, whether it's a golden calf or whether it's a president or it's a state, any state, right? And I think that to me, and in Jewish tradition, idolatry is always linked to barbarism. So, for instance, when Jewish rabbinic thinkers think about the figure of Pharaoh, that Pharaoh's tyranny and barbarism is intimately linked with the fact that Pharaoh thought he was a god. Right? That Pharaoh worshipped himself and asked to be worshipped, right? And I see elements of that with Donald Trump, and I see elements of that in the relationship with the state of Israel, and it worries me a lot.
I'm really glad that we at least have like the Christian nationalism framework, because like in my understanding of Christian nationalism, it is a framework. It's a cultural framework that sort of like, it's like a self-licking ice cream cone. It just kind of keeps going by itself, and it's supported by like decentralized network of like education systems, political activists, influencers, and so on and so forth. Like, is that one of the things that's sort of keeping sort of the message like together in Israel? Like they just have this entire army full of like people,
like social media influencers and stuff like that,
like a Russian bot farm.
I mean, I think in Israel, it's different than the United States. I think the thing to understand about Israel is that people who become accustomed to a system of legal supremacy usually identify with that system of legal supremacy with their own safety, right? I mean, think about white Americans during the era of slavery and Jim Crow, and you say to them,
Absolutely.
listen, we're not going to have this anymore. Black people are going to be equal. The common response was, if we're not slave owners, we will be the slaves, right? We will be in grave danger, right? White South Africans, Protestants in Northern Ireland, they felt that if the supremacist political systems were dismantled, their lives would be at grave risk. And that's the way most Israeli Jews think as well. So I just think, unfortunately, that is kind of common. Again, when you come of age, associating your safety with your supremacy. I think in the United States, there's more of an opportunity because American Jews are in this weird position where we've been raised, most of us, to support Israel and to support this supremacist political system. But here in America, we actually have generally the community has a commitment to supporting the idea of equality under the law, right? Being involved in the civil rights movement and things like that. So that's why I think American Jews are more able to say, wait a second, maybe these principles of treating people equally under the law are actually the principles that we should support there as well as here.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that because and I want to get into this even a little bit more with you on the theological resources that the Jewish theological resources that not only your Jewish brothers and sisters, but your human brothers and sisters could actually take, learn from, and that speak to this issue in Gaza, because I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor, I'm always talking about theological stuff. Our audience has heard me, but we haven't heard too many people that are Jewish. So the thing I love about it, and in terms of Jewish theology, the thing I love about it is we share this one scripture, right? We share the Hebrew scriptures as a sacred text, and I would just love to hear your perspective on the theological resources in the Hebrew scriptures and the tradition that can help address this moment.
Well, so the way Jews interact with the Hebrew, with the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, is really through the tradition of rabbinic commentary, through the Talmud, right? So this is in a way where Judaism and Christianity become very different, especially I think Protestantism. My sense is that Protestants is more of a tradition of going straight to the text, right? Reading the text, trying to understand it for yourself. For Jews, from a very, very early age, if Jews grow up in a traditional religious environment, they're reading the text with the rabbinic commentaries, right? And in a way, Judaism has to become an entirely new religion after the destruction of the Second Temple, because as you can know from the Hebrew Bible, if you look at what the Torah and the entire Hebrew Bible says about how you connect to God, a lot of it is by going to a temple and sacrificing animals. You notice we don't do that anymore, right? So what happened in Judaism was basically that when the temple was destroyed and the priestly class ended and the animal sacrifice ended, essentially rabbinic Judaism was formed, right, through prayer and study. And the Talmud, which is the foundational rabbinic text, becomes the entire kind of lens through which you understand the Hebrew Bible. And what I find fascinating about Talmud is that it's really it's a vast compendium of debates, of arguments, of discussions between rabbis at various different points, and then followed on by other generations of rabbis going through the medieval age up until today about how to make sense of these texts, right? And there are all kinds of different perspectives, but the way I see it, every generation is bringing its own experience, its own understanding of the world to these texts. And we have a tradition of really radical reinterpretation, radical redefinition of the text, right? And so one of the things that we can look at, for instance, is this constant admonition in the Hebrew Bible that comes out of the experience of the Exodus from Egypt, that you know the heart of the stranger because you are a stranger in the land of Egypt, right? And one of my favorite rabbinic interpretations of this is from a medieval Spanish commentator named Nachmanides, and he says, well, why should we always need to remember the heart of the stranger? He said, because when you see a stranger, an outcast in society, you think that nobody cares about that person because they have no power, right? Because they have no status. But the lesson of the Exodus from Egypt is that even if no human being appears to care, God always has a special concern for that person, right? And you should never think that that person is truly without any dignity or power, right? Because God sees them. And so for me, when I think about that, it's natural to think about people in Gaza. I mean, people in Gaza are still living in tents, right? Even though the war supposedly ended, but like more than 600 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed even since the ceasefire began, right? There's some food getting in, but no reconstruction. People have been living without the basic necessities of a decent life for years and years. I mean, I had a conversation. I've had so many conversations with friends I know who have family in Gaza, and the conversation just leave me speechless of what it is that people have been put through there. I mean, you know, one guy I know in the United States, he's from Gaza, and he has a lot of relatives there. They used to wish each other happy birthday on Facebook. And he said at one point, when he kept wishing family members happy birthday, someone from Gaza got in touch with him and said, for goodness sake, stop doing it. Don't you know how many of the people that you've wished happy birthday to are now dead? Talking like hundreds of people in his family, right? Another friend of mine from Gaza told me that he had a conversation with a schoolmate, a woman. There was no clean water in Gaza. She had no breast milk. Her child was screaming uncontrollably. And he talked to her on the phone and she said, how do I remain sane under these conditions, right? And so it seems to me like those are the strangers, you know, among us and the people created in God's image. And we as Americans should not be providing the weapons that are doing this to people. And I, as a Jew, should not be using my religious tradition to justify the destruction of people who are created in God's image every bit as much as I am.
I would say the exact same thing for Christian theology. I mean, it's unbelievable to me the amount of Christian theology that's been used to justify violence. And, you know, not only historically, but even now in terms of, you know, basically justifying the actions of, you know, military actions. And again, I don't know. It's such a tough thing because I understand there are just war arguments. I understand that there are a lot of Christians in the armed forces, and this is a majority Christian nation and has been for its history, and it complicates it, and the government makes it complicated because the government can't just be nice. You know, the government has different things it has to do. It has to establish order. It has to punish wrongdoing. It has to, you know, defend its borders, defend itself, right? And yet you see so many things happening and you're wondering where's the national security interest? Where is this actually making sense? I'm being told that this is for our national security, but I'm not really seeing the connection between kids being sniped and killed and my safety as an American.
Right.
I'm not seeing the connection there.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, I think that religious traditions can be most prophetic and most moral when they keep a very healthy distance from power, right? And they recognize they have a healthy skepticism of the state, whoever's in charge, and they see it as their role to question, right? Not to become entangled with the state and justify and become subject to the trappings of power like all human beings are, right? And so, I mean, I have tremendous admiration for so many people who have used Christian tradition in America to fight against slavery,
absolutely,
fight for civil rights, and to fight on the front lines now against I think really inhumane governments. But what I notice they tend to have in common, right, is that that they have a distance from power. And I think whether it's Christians, Muslims, Jews, or whatever, I think it's when religious people get too close to power that often is when they lose sight of the kind of the role of I think of religious people, which is to hold government to account and always to remember the centrality of the dignity of the human being.
You know, I'm curious if, well, here in America, one of the things that Josh was alluding to was DHS, DOD using Bible verses, social media posts and stuff to kind of support whatever it is they're doing. That's government basically reinterpreting scripture, you know, for the audience. Does Israel or Israel's government do anything similar? Like if you're trying to make a case for sort of the, you know, I don't know if it's fulfilled prophecy, if that's not the right term, you know, then it's like, I would imagine you would, but like, I'd love to just hear what you think about that.
Yes, unfortunately, that's very much the case. So first of all, Israel does not have a separation of church and state like we are supposed to have in the United States. Israel has actually two chief rabbis, and they are government employees, right? Israel has a whole system of rabbis who are government employees. And so the religious establishment is very, very much interwoven with the state, which I think produces a lot of corruption and also kind of moral corruption and, tendency to justify. And you also have Israeli religious leaders, like we see with the Trump administration, using language. It's not that I have a problem with a politician necessarily using religious language, but It seems to me it has to do fundamentally with what we believe religion is for, right? Is the purpose to recognize the value of the human being and their inherent dignity, or is it, as I think often happens in the case of the Trump administration, to find justifications for seeing people as lesser and therefore not deserving of life and dignity? And so that happens in Israel too. I mean, one of the things that Benjamin Netanyahu said after October 7th, which was very, very chilling, is he compared Hamas, or maybe even Palestinians in general, to this figure that first emerges in the book of Exodus, this figure of Amalek, right? And in the book of Exodus, the Amalekites kind of attack the Israelites as they're wandering through the desert, and there are these very, very disturbing languages in Exodus, and then I think again in Deuteronomy, about how you must basically destroy the Amalekites, right? And it's interesting. The rabbis, I think, understood that this was kryptonite, that this was very dangerous stuff. So one of the things that we say that the rabbis determined was that we don't know who the Amalekites are anymore. That, yes, there were a tribe in the Bible, but nobody can say, oh, those are the Amalekites, and therefore they must be destroyed, right? But Netanyahu goes, and actually it's a real violation of Jewish rabbinic tradition. He says, no, I know who they are, right? They're those guys who attacked us on October 7th. They're those guys in Gaza. And then you have what can be understood as basically a genocidal reference to the Bible, right? Because if you read the Bible without this scaffolding, then it has language which can sound very genocidal. And that to me is a really, really an example of how dangerous this use of religious texts can be.
I totally agree. And it's so funny because I remember hearing Netanyahu say that, and I remember thinking like, oh man, that's like seeing all of the biblical messages in Netanyahu's stuff. I mean, it's all over the place. And his speeches to the UN in English. And so who's he talking to if he's speaking in English?
100%.
So he's talking to evangelical Christians. So anyway, any white Christians or whatever that would support him, or Christians. So like I'm looking at this, and I remember years ago there was a pastor that spoke at a large church that I was at, and one of the best preachers I've ever heard, and just consistently. But he spoke and talked about the Amalekites, and then connected them to modern Muslims, and this fight that's continuing to happen between Jews and Muslims. And I just, like you just said that, I thought like, man, like, yes, I have been taught this, and I didn't even know that I was taught this. And so if I was sitting there, if you were to say to me, so do you agree that you should, based on this verse, that this is a justification for the systematic extermination of a people group, I would have said no. And yet, when you put it in certain terms, you make it so, oh, well, yeah, of course. It's biblical. It's the right thing. And it's just unbelievable how much that's happening. Happens.
No, and that's why it's all about how we use these texts. I mean, there's a rabbinic tradition that says that the way to understand the Amalekites is that it's the evil that exists within all of us, right? And so to extinguish Amalek is to extinguish the evil, or the evil impulses that exist within us, right? So that's the way of taking this tradition and actually making it a kind of, making it an exhortation to make yourself better, right? Rather than looking at another group of people and say they're the embodiment of evil.
Yeah. It's really a complicated thing. And it just brings out again to me, and I've been on a big kick about this, for quite a bit, but the biblical literacy in America is very, very bad. And yet it's a very religious country, right? And then still majority Christian. And yet even amongst those people that are, you would probably consider, Christian nationalists in terms of like, I think there's sociological definitions behind that. I'm not just trying to say that as a label, either adherents or sympathizers, right? There's probably quite a bit of biblical literacy. And the reason I say that is just extrapolating from how I understand biblical literacy in general from the surveys I've seen and then putting it on. And so there's probably more biblical literacy among that, but not enough. And especially, and then even what do we mean by biblical literacy? Because I don't even mean knowing the Bible or knowing what it says. I mean knowing how to interpret it. Number one, understand it in context, and then number two, apply it. And if you get a bad interpretation, you're going to get a bad application. And so, it is so important to raise our awareness of what these biblical texts were, how they functioned in their time, the fact that, that original covenant, again, the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the modern Israel can't be ancient Israel because it doesn't have those. It doesn't have the same law. I mean, quite frankly, right? So it doesn't have the same covenant and law and all that. Like you said, you can't even do the sacrifices. So you've had to move it in a different direction, which is great. But one thing is that so many people don't even understand that. They have no clue around those things. And so the amount of biblical ignorance creates this vacuum where people essentially believe whatever.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm absolutely right. And I think that I've always found this term Judeo-Christian very, very, very disturbing because to me, it's basically an effort to say, Jews are included, but Muslims are not, right? Or Muslims and other people are not. And to me, it's not to me a surprise that if you allow anti-Muslim bigotry to flourish, sooner or later they're going to get around to Jews too, right? I mean, it seems to me basically you either have to basically fight for the idea of an America where everybody is treated equally and everyone has dignity and everyone's an owner of the country. And one of my greatest frustrations with a lot of the most powerful American Jewish organizations is they have basically, I think, accepted this massive amount of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia and anti-trans, all this stuff, basically, because they think Donald Trump has been good for Israel. And I think now we're seeing how foolish it is, because if you listen to Nick Fuentes, he's very clear. He basically says, listen, in the Republican Party, Trump's Republican Party, I can say whatever I want about Muslims. I can say whatever I want about Black people. And you're telling me I can't say whatever I want about Jews? Why not? Right? It's like you have no plausible, coherent argument against that.
No.
You basically tolerate other forms of bigotry. And I think ultimately that's what I find so dangerous about this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. And the rise in popularity of Nick Fuentes is one of the more disturbing things that I've seen from the stuff that he said. I'm, it's just heartbreaking. And I hope that we can continue to get a better alternative things out there. I'm also a very, very, very big proponent of free speech, even very offensive speech. And so, I'm not saying that Nick Fuentes anything should happen to Nick Fuentes. Sure. I think people should stop listening to him because he's bad and just go to better arguments and then leave him so he's basically a nobody, but unfortunately I don't see that happening. What would you say is one faithful political action that you would say, hey, American Jews right now, or even you could spread it beyond those concerned about this, Israel and Gaza, what would you recommend for them to do as a result of this conversation?
It's a great question. I mean, so one of my favorite lines from there's a section of the Talmud called Pirkei Avot, and there's a line which says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." And I think, to me, one of the biggest problems in the debate about Israel and Palestine in the United States and among American Jews is that we don't listen to Palestinians very much. There's a lot of talking about, this happens with Muslims too, there's a lot of talking about Palestinians and not a lot of actually listening to them, right? And it seems to me that is a recipe for ignorance and dehumanization. You have to listen to people. If you see people as equal human beings, you need to actually listen to them. And I think, to me, part of the, if we listen to Palestinians and had a better understanding of their experience, I think we would act in a more humane and empathetic and decent way. You know, a lot of people in the American Jewish community, the American Jewish leaders say that if you're anti-Zionist, it means you're anti-Semitic, you're bigoted, right? But if you talk to Palestinians and listen to their experience, say, well, my grandfather was expelled from his home, and now we've lived under military occupation without basic rights, you understand why Palestinians would be anti-Zionist. You can see it through their eyes, right? And so I think, to me, that would be the one thing. It's one thing I say to Jewish audiences, probably more than anything else, is to say, invite Palestinians in to speak, read books and watch films by Palestinians, try to understand the experience of other people. It'll make you more humane.
Well, Peter, this has been great. And I got to tell you, right before we recorded, I went on Amazon and looked up your book and was reading the reviews, and people love your book. and I love for you just to kind of just plug it a little bit more. Where can people get it? I hear you have a Substack, so if you can just tell us a little more about that. And yeah, just sell your
Sure. So I have a Substack. It's called the Beinart Notebook. What I do every week actually is I do an interview with someone, and a lot of Palestinians I talk to, but I also reach out and try to talk to a lot of Jews who disagree with me and try to have kind of, respectful conversations where we can talk about our own differences within this very divided community. And yeah, the book is called Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. It's a pretty short book, but it's basically an argument that there's a certain understanding of what it means to be Jewish, which has led us to this very, very dark place in which so many of our Jewish leaders will defend what has now been called by the International Association of Genocide Scholars a genocide, and that we need a different understanding of what it means to be Jewish, and that we need to challenge what I think of as this idolatry in which you say that your worship of this state is the thing that makes you a Jew in good standing. That ultimately at the core of Judaism is not a state, it's our recognition of the God-given dignity of all human beings.
Well, you can't get better than that. Thank you so much, Peter, for spending some time with us. It's been great.
Yes.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our audience, hey, thanks again for stopping by. And as always, make sure you keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.